How's it going, YouTube? My name is LB Ninja7, your resident Mistweaver monk and favorite WoW healing YouTuber. And guys, today we're making a very fun video. It is a thought experiment, so I'm just going to be talking a bunch of nonsense to you guys. And feel free to follow along in the comments, leaving all of your opinions, and we can have a great discussion. But as I said, this is a for fun video. None of the changes that we're going to be talking about in today's video are coming to the game. And I fully acknowledge that some things that I might say might just be a wrong or a hot take, and I'm excited to hear about that down in the comments below. But what are we doing today? Well, we're actually looking at the meta, I guess, just a healing chart. I just have one healing chart for a raid pulled up. It is a throughput chart, but we're going to take a look at the meta, talk about why a lot of people are really enjoying this current meta, the current state of balancing, and why a lot of people just do not. There are some people that are just not happy campers right now. And what could we do theoretically if I were in charge, if I had all the buttons in front of me? What would I do to kind of tune things? If I were to tune things to my liking, what would I do? So a blanket statement, obviously this is going to be a completely subjective opinion based video, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get into it. So every season in World of Warcraft history, there has always been like a top dog, or maybe one or two or three top dogs, and then a couple down at the bottom or just in the middle. There's always a balance, and it's not always perfectly balanced. It's kind of impossible to perfectly balance all 7 healers or all 6 healers in the past. But today, that's what I am going to try to do. I'm going to try to suggest a couple of changes to each spec to kind of bring them more in line with the others and to make them kind of into that golden state that some healers are currently in. And we're going to try to do this to a way where if we fix one spec in Raid, for example, we won't break them in Mythic Plus. So I'm trying to think of changes that we could do to fix them in both forms of content and get them to a great state in both forms of content. Because I'm sure as you probably, like those of you who play Restoration Shaman, you're probably loving this season in Raid, but not having as much fun in Mythic Plus, at least not right now. But without further ado, let's go and get into the first change, and let's start off by just talking about what we're looking at. So this is just a throughput chart. So obviously Mistweavers put out more healing than something like a Disc Priest or a Holy Priest, but this is strictly throughput. This does not show how much they bring to a raid. And this is not necessarily a tier list. Like if you look, Disc Priests are way below Mistweaver, yet they're seen as like the A+ tier up there with Mistweaver in raid. I just have this on the screen for show because it is kind of like a visual indicator. But let's talk about some of the things that are kind of downfalls for certain classes. So the obvious one is Holy Priests are kind of sitting well below the rest of the pack in terms of raid healing and utility. And then there's things like Preservation Evoker that are seeing some positive changes coming up, but Holy Paladin is just not packing that same punch that it used to, especially since on PTR these two specs looked like they were going to be clear front runners, and now they've kind of landed, as you see here, at the bottom of the pack. And then Restoration Druid, Disc Priest, Restoration Shaman, although they're all very similar in throughput, you could probably argue that Disc Priest is just much stronger than these because it brings a lot more damage while also providing this amount of throughput. It brings PI, brings a lot of utility, whereas Resto Druid, they only bring their Druid buff of 5% verse, Roar to speed everyone. They just don't have as much utility as Disc Priest. And then Mistweaver is just a throughput king. They are outputting a lot more healing than the rest of the group, so maybe bring that more back in line with the rest of the group without messing up all the strides that they've made in a Mythic Plus environment. And then in Mythic Plus, we're seeing 3 healers kind of dominate the scene. So we're going to try to suggest some slight tweaks to some of these guys' kits to kind of bring everyone into the same realm of viability in Mythic Plus as well. So let's start off with where I think everyone should land. I think this graph is in a pretty close order to where it should land. Like I've said, Disc Priest brings a lot more utility than a Resto Druid, so ideally, Restoration Druid should be moved somewhere up here, honestly up there with Mistweaver, because these two are solely throughput machines. They don't provide any utility like Holy Priest do with Symbol of Hope. Resto Shamans, you could argue Spirit Link Totem. It does give damage mitigation if you can stack the group. But Disc Priests have Barrier, which gives mitigation. Holy Paladins have Aura Mastery, which provides damage mitigations. Like things like Preservation Evoker, Restoration Druid, and Mistweaver, they only provide throughput, so they should be at the top of a throughput chart, kind of like Mistweaver is. I do think Mistweaver is very obviously a clear outlier, so we are going to be slightly tweaking them in the negative direction if we can, but in a better way than they have been. We're going to suggest better ways to nerf this class than what the devs have been doing. But with Restoration Druid, how I would change Restoration Druid is I think there is a lot of power in the Grove Guardians, and I get it. They're trying to push this new ability. It's a new play style, just something you play around. A passive healer, I think they do like having one class be the passive healer. So if someone is a passive healer enjoyer, then you could swap to that class. Like in Shadowlands, if you like passive healing, you played Mistweaver. Now you play the Grove Guardians Druid build. But I think this healing is a little off. These guys are performing exceptionally well in Mythic Plus environments because they cast Nourish on people that need healing. Now, if you don't know, Nourish is a single target blast of a spot heal. So these guys in Raid are also just going to be spot healing left and right people that need healing. But you can take a talent to where when you spawn them in, right once you cast the spell, it'll spawn or it'll cast a Wild Growth. So that's why this healing breakdown does show some Wild Growth healing. What I would do to Restoration Druid, change number one, is I would take some of the power out of these Nourishes and put more power into strengthening the Wild Growth that they cast. Now, what would this accomplish? I believe it would take a little bit of power out of these guys healing in a Mythic Plus environment. You know, if you do like an AoE heal, yes, it does hit all 5 people in a Mythic Plus environment, but you're just going to get a lot less value by taking away some of that strength of the spot healing that these guys are doing, so that you can't just rely on these guys to do all the healing and go into cat form and just blast a bunch of damage. Wild Growth, it will fall off, and these guys will lose a bit more strength in the long run, so you can't just sit in cat form forever. Let these guys do all the healing until they despawn. So I think if you were to transfer some of the power from Nourish, so make these heal maybe like 10% less, but make the Wild Growth that these guys cast heal for 10% more, not only would that just transfer some power and kind of take away some of their strength in a Mythic Plus environment, bring them back more in line with the rest of the pack, but giving more AoE healing, AoE throughput in a raid environment could help push them up a little closer. Now, I don't think it would push them up quite to the Mistweaver level. If anything, a change like this, it probably wouldn't even change much. But if we were to adjust that Wild Growth number by a lot, make it very impactful, make it a big AoE heal, then we could bring it up in line with Resto Druid. So this simple change could boost their AoE healing, thus making them stronger in a raid environment. But we want them to be even stronger since they don't bring a lot of like, DR. You have to make them stronger, make them a throughput machine like Mistweaver is currently. What else would I do? Well, I would, by the way, this is just a random log that I pulled up, but I would boost the power of Efflorescence. You know, Efflorescence is the ring of healing that they put down. It heals 3 people at a time that are standing inside of it that need healing. This spell is just very lackluster in all forms of content. You see here, this is the top log. And this guy only cast an AoE heal spell that used to be a mandatory spell. If you've ever played Restoration Druid in the past, you've ever watched a Resto Druid guide, it is to keep your Efflorescence, this is the number 1 tip, keep your Efflorescence at a 100% uptime. Cast it right once it's about to fall off because it's just good throughput. It's an AoE heal spell in a raid environment. Ideally, those are your best spells, like Wild Growth, for example. But Efflorescence is just not performing well. I mean, not a lot of healing from one cast and just not worth it, apparently, in this log to cast it more than once. So what would I do to this spell? Well, I believe that since we're going to be taking some strength out of their Mythic Plus healing by doing the other change that we've discussed, and we want to add more AoE viability to the spell, we could give this spell what I like to call the Mythic Plus treatment. If you guys have been following along with Mistweaver Monk, you know that they recently gave them a talent that made their Shayloons hit 5 people. Resonating Spheres getting that 5-person treatment back. So that's what I like to call the Mythic Plus treatment, balancing things to a 5-person target cap. I think Efflorescence would be a great spell for that. Just make it hit 2 more people. It might be a little broken at first for like the first week that this is implemented, but then we could adjust the numbers accordingly. I think those 2 changes alone could push Resto Druid very high. And if you know how Resto Druid works, you know that Efflorescence also applies a hot. If you take a talent, it'll apply a hot, and those will boost the mastery. So all of your other healing will be affecting those 5 targets more as well due to your mastery. So I just think those could be some excellent changes that could kind of adjust their power in a Mythic Plus environment while just boosting their AoE healing and not making them such a rejuve Grove Guardian spam machine. Because honestly, I have not enjoyed my Druid as much as I thought I would this tier, because I mean, like, spamming this button it's honestly, it gets so old so quick in a raid environment. I don't know, maybe you guys are still diehard Druids, so let me know down in the comments below. But that's how I would change Restoration Druid. Next up, we're going to talk about Disc Priest. And guys, I'll keep it short and simple. I love where Disc Priest is at. They're doing a ton of damage in a Mythic Plus environment, which I think is fine. Maybe you could argue it's a bit too much damage compared to the other healers, but they're doing excellent damage while providing great throughput, having a great toolkit for a Mythic Plus environment. I think instead of bringing them down, or me suggesting for the developers to bring them down to the level of the rest of the healers, I think we're going to set Disc Priest as one of the standards. Keep them as they are, adjust everyone around them to be more in a balanced state like them, and I think that would make things so much better, make things so much more fun, and just give you more viability to play all these other options instead of gutting these guys like they did to Holy Paladin back in 10.1.7. But since we're going to be keeping Disc Priest as strong as they are, we have to talk about Holy Priest. And these guys, I've heard a lot of hoopla about these guys. These guys say that they're in the worst state of all the healers, and these throughput charts do indicate that. But I will admit they do bring a lot of raid utility, and that's why in seasons past, you've seen like 2 Holy Priests brought to raid groups, but also granted they were throughput machines in those seasons as well to go along with their raid utility. Now, with Holy Priests, before this season started, there was a lot of hype around these guys, around their tier set specifically, because it was proccing pretty often. But as we got into the season, we realized, one, that it just wasn't as powerful as we thought it would be, but also it's RNG dependent, and they're back to relying on their Echo of Light or their mastery to do a big portion of their heals. But these guys also just lack kind of an identity. You see here, I mean, obviously I'm just looking at one log, but I've looked at a couple other logs as well. They do cast all of their holy words, like the whole play style is around Prayer of Mending and their holy words, and just resetting their holy words and applying a bunch of free renews that way. You see here 1 cast on renew, a small hot, but they've gotten a lot of healing out of it because their tier set applies those. But they just fall behind on the throughput chart because their AoE heal spells are just not that strong. Yes, they are playing around Sanctify and trying to reset this cooldown, but it just doesn't do I like to say, a sexy amount of healing. Same with their Circle of Healing. They are even playing with Holy Nova. I mean, imagine if a Disc Priest was playing around Holy Nova in a raid environment just for AoE healing. They're also using Halo. They're trying to use everything in their toolkit to compete with these other healers in terms of AoE healing. So how would I buff Holy Priest? Well, I think there are 2 changes that could help them a lot. One, to bring their throughput a little bit back more in line with the rest of the group. You see here, they're still just sitting pretty at the bottom. But 2, to give them more of their like raid utility back that they have had stripped away from them in the past. So how would I do that? Well, one, the number 1 change I would do is give them a talent, or just tack on a talent to just a random talent that already exists. Like, say they just tacked on an extra line under something like Light of the Naru. I have no idea which talent it would be, but something that just says, oh, and by the way, your Holy Nova will hit twice. And make it work to where they let their Rhapsody stack up to 20 times, and they press Holy Nova, and it does a big AoE smack around them that does healing and damage. Then it would also just reverberate that 20 stack Rhapsody Holy Nova as well. Why would this make any sense? Well, it is Holy Nova, but it just doesn't make sense that it's honestly more powerful for a Disc Priest, especially in a Mythic Plus environment, than it is for Holy Priests. But two, this would just fix a big issue. They do struggle a little bit when it comes to AoE damage. They don't have as many tools as some of the other healers do. So this would also help that, just basically doubling their Holy Nova damage. And two, since they are relying on Holy Nova for AoE healing in a raid environment, basically doubling this healing source would just give them a little bit more, oomph to their AoE healing rotation. And yes, they do have to let it stack up 20 times to get max value out of this, but I think this could be a fun thing. Just giving them a talent somehow, but don't take anything away. Don't remove a currently existing talent. Just tack it on to something existing. Maybe even tack it on to Rhapsody, because if you just said, oh, and by the way, if you're holy, it now makes your Holy Nova hit twice or something. I think that could be a very cool change and very fun. And I could see it in Mythic Plus also helping not only their 5-man healing. If everyone's stacked, you could just blast everyone's full health. But it could also help their AoE damage. It will hit twice. It does do good AoE damage. I think that could be a fun change. Now, I don't think it would move them up much in the charts. As you see here in this log, it's only what? 3% of their overall healing, so just barely tweaking that up a little bit. But this next change, giving them more raid viability in a comp standpoint, like if you look at an entire healing comp, I think this could help, this next change could help them a lot. Now, as you know, their Symbol of Hope, it was a big raid tool that was kind of used and abused by the Race to World First people back in seasons past, but they nerfed it, basically gutting it coming into this tier. Instead of recovering a minute off everyone's defensive CDs, you only get 30 seconds off. And then instead of regaining, I think it was 15% of your missing mana, it's only 10% of your missing mana. And as you know, as a whole, to compound on top of this change to Holy Priest, they basically nerfed a healer's mana across the board. For the most part, most healers are kind of suffering in some ways in terms of mana. So this didn't just hurt them, it hurt all of us. And I think one great way to buff Holy Priest to be more relevant in the meta, in the raid meta especially, is to buff that number. Just make it 15% again. Hell, 20%. Okay, call me crazy. I said it there. I said it. 20% of all missing mana. No, because then you just run like 4 Holy Priests. You wouldn't run 4 Holy Priests. You probably run 2. I don't know, but it would shake things up. You can't deny that. But that would give them a lot more love from the rest of your Holy Priest, or from the rest of your healing community. Like if you think about your core raiding healing group, there's like 4 or 5 of you guys. One of them is a priest, and one week they just randomly hop into raid as their Holy Priest, and everyone's like, oh man, here we go. We got to carry this guy. He's not playing disc this week. That shouldn't be a thing, especially for a class that shares a spec or shares a class with another spec. It should not be a thing where one is just the clear front runner of the two. Make them more competitive, even if Disc Priest is supposed to be the shiny new toy of the season. And I think, yes, they probably would still sit at the bottom, for sure. I mean, we're only buffing a small AoE heal spell. But, I mean, it could bring them back in line with the rest of these guys in terms of viability. And that's how I would change Holy Priest. And I think Holy Priest is kind of... I'm at a loss for words when I try to think of how to fix them in Mythic Plus. But if you want a Band-Aid fix, just buff their 5-man healing, 5-man damage, and just call it a day. That's all I can do, because I've said it in the past, I am not a Holy Priest expert. Whenever I load into my Priest, especially recently, I do play Disc Priest most of the time. All right, next up, we're going to be taking a look at Holy Paladins. If you look at the throughput chart, these guys are still falling a little behind to the rest of the good pack, where I'd say everyone should look to get up to. So there are some changes needed, but also their playstyle is just wonky. It's very easy. I've been loading up my Holy Paladin, doing a bunch of LFR and normal raids recently, and I'm having a lot of fun, actually. But it's just weird. It does not feel like Holy Paladin at all. But in terms of Mythic Plus, I mean, they're performing well. They're probably slightly below like some of the front runners, but you see them popping up in top runs left and right. So Holy Paladins are looking fine in a Mythic Plus environment, but there are a couple of changes that I would love to see to kind of diversify the Holy Paladin playstyle while also bringing them up a little bit in terms of raid healing. Now, a couple things. One thing is that they are casting when AoE healing is supposed to reign supreme. If you have an option to press one global cooldown that does a spot heal versus one global cooldown that does an AoE heal, unless you need to spot heal one person to save their life, normally in a raid environment, as a blanket statement, you'll just get more throughput from the AoE heal, right? Well, no. In a raid environment, you see paladins pressing Word of Glory, their spot heal spender, instead of Light of Dawn. And it's just weird. It's just weird. So the first change that I would do to kind of make their AoE spender more viable is just to buff it. Just give it like a 5 or 10% buff. Make it at least more of a decision, an in the moment decision, instead of, okay, instead of just, hey, I'll get more throughput if I just do the spot heal version instead. So just make it more of a decision by buffing this more in line to the rest of the AoE heal spells. We don't have to gut every AoE heal spell. Not every healer should be strictly a spot heal, a shock heal healer. Yes, they are the shock heal class, but it makes no sense. The AoE heal spell is just not viable in a raid environment right now. It's so weird. So the first thing, obviously, is I would buff slightly Light of Dawn. And I don't think this would break their Mythic Plus play or performance, because in a Mythic Plus environment, you're already just Word of Glorying anyways. I think even when, like last season, when Light of Dawn was the more viable thing to press in a raid environment for more throughput, in Mythic Plus, you would still always see them cast or spend on Word of Glory. And then the second change that I would do is I'll probably receive some flack for this one. Man, I can't even get it to pop up because all 4 builds run Avenging Wrath. But what I would do is I would buff Avenging Crusader, I believe is what it's called. Let's open up the talent calculator. Okay, yes, I would buff Avenging Crusader. Look, no one is playing this talent right now, but I've heard from a lot of Holy Paladin players, and also for myself, like as a Mistweaver player, this is one of their coolest abilities. Yes, Avenging Wrath is obviously one of like a fan favorite. It is just super Paladin-esque, but Avenging Crusader is sick. If you don't know, it's a buff you give yourself, and for a while, a couple of your damaging spells heal whenever, or based on the damage they do, kind of like ancient teachings from Mistweaver monks. But people are kind of still in like a terrified state of this being the meta play or the meta choice, because of how strong it was last season when they initially buffed it. If you don't remember, they buffed it to do, I believe it was 500% of the damage that you do with those couple of abilities split among 5 people. But then they nerfed it, they gutted it down to 360, and a couple people still did play it. But for a while, this was such a sick ability. I mean, if you did have a chance to play this, I'm sure you remember just how amazing it was. I would not push it to the same numbers that it was back when it was broken. I would not push it up to 500%. But honestly, I'd push it up at least to 400, maybe even up to 450% of the damage that you do. Now, why am I not afraid of this ability getting broken again? Well, one, no one is playing it, so a slight adjustment would not break this ability. But 2, if you look at the build that Holy Paladins are playing, they're still using that one talent. What's it called? Tower of Radiance, I believe. Tower of Radiance. Yes, Tower of Radiance to get free Holy Power whenever they do their casted spells. So you see a lot of Holy Paladins not even pressing some of their damaging buttons like Crusader Strike, you know, a traditional Holy Paladin way to generate their holy power. But instead, they're generating all of their holy power from holy shocks and just casting like Flash of Lights and where's a Holy Light just to get free power, because it's just more efficient. If you can get holy power from casting a heal spell versus doing a damage spell, if you're trying to parse or just do any amount of healing, obviously you're going to press the healing spell. So you see some Holy Paladins not even touching the boss, standing in melee only for consecration damage. It's just such a weird time. So what would I do? Kind of give you a choice, kind of like how Mistweavers have right now, where you can take the Chi-Ji or the Yulon build and do fine healing with both. Obviously, one will be better than the other. You can't balance those perfectly with each other. Do the same treatment for Holy Paladin. Make Avenging Crusader a little bit stronger so it's more of a viable option. And I think with those two changes, it would shake up Holy Paladin instead of this just only having a caster viable build, shake them up, but also make them do a little bit more competitive throughput in a raid environment. Get them back up in line with these guys with two different builds. I think that would be great for the meta. And then with Holy Paladin, I think to a fine state after those changes. Let's bounce back to the mana discussion. Now, like I said, a lot of healers are struggling big time with mana, and I think the number one struggler is Restoration Shaman, dude. These guys are on the struggle bus. They just dump mana. But if you look here on one of the top logs, I think this is the top Shaman log, they are only casting Chain Heals and Riptides basically for their healing. And if you look at Chain Heal, it costs 12,000 mana. I believe it's 12,000. And for the most part, you cast Chain Heals. A lot of times nowadays, you're just spamming it. But to play like super optimally throughout history, you would cast these in chains of 2. So you just do 2, one after the other. I believe it's the Tidebringer talent that makes you want to do that. But you just pop 2. So all in all, spending 24,000 mana at a time. But yeah, just chain heal after chain heal, it just messes up your mana bar to a crazy amount. So the number one change I would do is to help these guys out. I would nerf or buff, however you want to look at it, the mana cost of Chain Heal. Bring it down to 10,000. I mean, I know that's a lot of mana that they'd be saving over a fight, because I believe, what would that be, like 60,000 mana saved overall from this one log, 62,000, I think. I mean, come on. They are just blasting their mana bar and still not up here with Mistweaver. I mean, it's just crazy. It's crazy. Or just cut it down to 11,000 and then do this other change that I think could help them. Now, if you don't know, Shamans have something called Mana Tide Totem. So you put down a totem and then people around you, healers around you, will just start to regen a little bit of mana. It's honestly, it's not a crazy amount, especially coming from talking about Holy Priests. It's not a crazy amount. Also, it does have a range, so you'd have to like coordinate with, say, your Mistweaver monks or your Holy Paladins to get them in to come and get some mana to sip up, stand next to you. So it's just clunky, and it's seen, I believe it's seen quite a few nerfs recently just to bring the whole mana strain back more in line. I would love to see this spell buffed. Either one, giving it better range, or just, making it unlimited range so that it can hit all of your healers and not just favor those who are stacked on top of you. Or bring it back to, I believe it was 100% increased mana regeneration. I would love to see that. Just double how much mana you're getting back. And it would just make mana a lot more friendly right now, because mana sucks. It is the worst thing to have nerfed about your class, or to have bad about your classes running out of mana. And these guys are double dipping in that because they're helping out healers less with Mana Tide Totem, and they're also drowning themselves by how many chain heals they're casting. So I mean, just help these guys out. It would push them up in the throughput meters for sure, because they'd have more mana to work with. But it wouldn't make them more powerful, because their heal spells heal a good amount right now. They're very efficient and budgeted, but just changing the mana efficiency of this class would make strides. I'm sure the Restoration Shaman community would agree with me in that fact. You guys are struggling with mana. I see it. I feel bad asking for an Innervate whenever we bring in our Resto Shaman into the group, because I see just how much you guys struggle on mana. So I think that would fix Restoration Shaman, and also would help out their Mythic Plus play. And also it would help out their Mythic Plus performance. Their Mythic Plus performance is also pretty lackluster to what it has been in the past. Part of that is due to their damage, but they're seeing a lot of good, positive damage buffs to things like Chain Lightning, Acid Rain is also receiving a buff, so that also will double dip into their passive damage in a raid environment. But they're seeing good damage buffs, but having more mana to work with on each pool would help them out a ton. You're seeing a lot of Resto Shamans do a 0 chain heal build in Mythic Plus environment, which if it gets the job done, it gets the job done. But it's very inefficient. They're not allowed to squeeze in as many damage globals because they're having to spot heal each person instead of double chain healing everyone all at once. So just these changes would go a long way to making them more efficient in both forms of content. And then lastly, we have the 2 green classes. So Preservation Evoker, I'll go ahead and get them out of the way. They are slightly below the rest of the pack in terms of throughput performance, and I do believe they should be bumped up here, kind of between the Shaman and, up here with where I think Druid should land. However, these guys are really suffering from Augmentation Evoker. It's just so weird to have 4 Evokers in a group. So if your group has 3 augmentations, then why would you bring a Preservation Evoker? And then also these guys are struggling because honestly, Mistweavers are just a better choice than Preservation Evoker. I know a lot of the Preservation community has swapped from Preservation to Mistweaver. However, I saw a huge uproar when they initially nerfed these guys, their Resonant Sphere, back in, I believe, Season 2, when they nerfed it to hit 3 targets or to apply an echo to 3 people instead of 5. So, I'm going to go ahead and say hands off on these guys. I think buffing Resonating Sphere, which is what modifies their Temporal Anomaly talent, I think this going to a 5 target cap instead of 3 targets is an excellent change. And of course, I am blocking it. I think this is an excellent change that they're about to make. And I would say I'd rather just let that change play out first and see, because that's going to add a lot of power. One, it's going to make them a lot more consistent of a healer in a Mythic Plus environment, because now you're able to hit all 5 people, apply a weakened echo before a big slam of damage in a Mythic Plus environment. And that is excellent. That is excellent. A great change, giving them the Mythic Plus treatment. But also, you're giving this spell, this talent, a 66% buff, and making it hit more AoE targets, making it more raid viable as well. So I do think this small change, although it looks like a small change, it's going to push one of their better playstyle abilities up higher and make them able to put echoes on a lot more people so they can have big Dream Breath ramps. And I think that is a huge thumbs up, and I'm excited to see how this plays out, because I think it will push them to a level where I would like to see them. And then last up, we have Mistweavers. So let's just go ahead and come over here. You guys know Mistweavers are kind of at a flavor of the month, and it's mostly because they're very strong. But I do think also it's getting hyped up a little bit too much, because a lot of people have never played Mistweaver in the past. So they're just trying it out and really loving it, because it really is the most fun heal spec. All biases aside, look, I said it, it is the most fun heal spec. But right now, we're seeing them perform very well in both forms of content, especially throughput and raid. Now, I do believe they should be at the top, not just because I play them. Trust me, I know some people are going to hate on me in the comments because I think Mistweavers should be strong. But I'm saying that about a lot of the specs that only provide like throughput. And yes, Mistweavers do provide a lot of raid buffs if they are the only monk in the raid. However, if you also do have a Brewmaster or at least one Windwalker in your raid group, they literally don't bring those raid buffs. It becomes redundant at that point. But coming into 10.2, they made a lot of great changes. They made a lot of irrelevant buttons relevant again, and I think that's very important. You guys probably remember when I was talking about Holy Paladin, that's very important. Giving a class playstyle diversity is huge in the longevity of that class and the success of that class. Because if a class only has one playstyle, you're going to play that until you get tired of it, and then you're going to make a swap. And although that's good for Blizzard, that's not good for your mental health in terms of how much you enjoy the game, how long you'll enjoy the game. So they buffed Essence Font to be at a good point. They buffed Expel Harm, I'm sure you guys know, to be at a good point and be a pressable button again. And they said they wanted you guys, they wanted us to press these buttons again. Now, they've been very hands-off with Expel Harm. They've just let it be strong, let it be a good ability, a good safety option coming into 10.2. And big thumbs up to them on that point. By the way, a damaged thumb at this point. But with Essence Font, they have just repeatedly nerfed it. Now, don't get me wrong, it does good throughput when you play around it. And of course, this log, only press it 5 times. They probably are not taking the talent that buffs it. Yeah, so they are not taking Upwelling. They are taking Font of Life, though. But yeah, there are some ways that you can modify Essence Font to kind of really utilize and capitalize on those buffs. Let me swap over here. But they made these changes, and they looked at them, and they said, look, we were a little heavy-handed on the buffs to this spell. Let's basically gut it to a point where it's not playable again. They had already nerfed it to a good point where some people were playing it. Some people had already swapped off the Essence Font build, and it was in a fine spot. And then they further nerfed it again, and it's just very questionable. So I am not saying that Mistweaver does not need a nerf. However, I'm saying they should have nerfed it in another way. Keep Essence Font relevant, but nerf their overall throughput. And how would they do that? Well, I think a great thing that they could look at is how a lot of people are swapping to the talent Tear of Mourning, which makes your Enveloping Mist cleave. Oh gosh, of course an ad comes up. It makes, and of course I'm covering it. Oh my goodness. But it makes your Enveloping Mist cleave onto the targets that have a Renewing Mist. So this accomplishes a lot. It accomplishes a ton. So if you don't know, your Enveloping Mist causes that target to take increased healing from your other sources, but also our tier set causes anyone that has a Renewing Mist to receive 50% increased healing. So something like Tear of Mourning can really help your healing benefit from all those buffs. And this is causing a lot of throughput. All of this on top of the fact that they have been buffing all of Mistweaver's spot healing to make their Mythic Plus time to top a lot shorter. But it's also been making things like Enveloping Mist do a lot of healing. You come back to this log. Let me come back to the healing. You come back to this log. Enveloping Mist is cleaving onto a ton of people because with your Yulon ramps, with how you're playing, you can keep Renewing Mist on a lot of people at any given moment and have a lot of Enveloping Mist cleaving. If you have 20 Renewing Mists out and 1 Enveloping Mist out, that Enveloping Mist will be dipping into all 20 people for the full 20% with Tear of Mourning. So you can just get a ton of throughput off of this one talent alone. Now, how would I change Mistweaver? One is obviously I would revert at least the last Essence Font nerf that they did. So I believe it was a 10% healing nerf. I would revert that completely. And then I would also, ideally, if that's not enough, I would revert the nerf to Upwelling. So instead of Upwelling stacking up to 15 times, I'd make it stack up to 18 times once again, because I mean, it's a sick talent, okay? And it's just fun not pressing a button, letting it charge up, kind of like Holy Nova with Rhapsody. It's fun letting that ability charge up and then blasting it all at once. But yes, I'm not saying I would just buff Mistweaver, trust me. I would nerf them a lot, okay? I would nerf the healing of Enveloping Mist by something like 20%. Look, our spot healing is fine, especially with Vivify, but the healing, the individual healing that a single hot of Enveloping Mist does is a ton because of all the modifiers that we can apply to it. But also it's just a very chunky hot. But just like Shaman's tier set does, this Tear of Mourning causes it to cleave on everyone for a value of its own healing. So if we nerf that healing, not only are we nerfing the amount of healing that hot is doing individually, but we're nerfing the amount of AoE healing that Mistweaver is going to be able to do. So maybe nerfing it by 20 might even be a little too much, honestly. But I would nerf this spell specifically by a good amount to compensate for bringing back Essence Font to its original power, or its power at the beginning of the tier, to a lesser amount. So I would buff a spell that is going to be back to not being pressed, but nerf one of their biggest power points. And I believe no matter how you think Mistweaver should be performing right now, I think that would be a good change. Now, obviously, I'm saying 15 or 20% for the nerf that I would do to Enveloping Mist. I don't have all the numbers how that would adjust things, but just nerf that spell individually, or that hot individually, to a point where it would nerf them even with those essence font changes added on top of that. And I think no matter how much you enjoy Mistweaver, this would make them weaker in all forms. It would make their ramps weaker, but also their passive throughput right now with the Tier of Morning build a little bit weaker. So I think it would take a lot off of them, but give them another big button to press with their Thunder Focus Tea and Essence Font. And guys, those are the changes that I would make to bring all the healers back a little bit more in line with where I personally think they should be. Now, like I've said before, I am super excited to see you guys, one, roast me down in the comments, but two, leaving your opinions. What would you change? I love this style video because it just opens up a world of creativity. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think. And while you're down there, make sure and subscribe and hit the like button because all those sellout things really push my channel and help me continue to try to be a full-time YouTuber. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and a special thanks to my Patreons, which are these guys on the screen. Now, if you want to see your name alongside these guys on the screen, check out the Patreon link down in the description below. It's the best way to help this channel. It is what keeps my lights on, keeps me, living my dream of being a YouTuber. And there are a ton of different tiers that you guys can choose to support. So make sure and check out that link down in the description. And guys, that's going to do it for this video. It was very fun. I love these theory crafting, random, stupid nonsense videos because it's just what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm excited to continue this discussion with you guys down in the comments. Have a great holiday season. Whatever holiday you celebrate, make sure you guys celebrate it with your family and enjoy the holidays. Stay safe. Once again, I apologize for not uploading a ton during the season, but these are all pre-recorded because I will be visiting my family, enjoying that family time. I hope that you guys do as well. Guys, I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, take care.